Okay, this will be a video about the 1983 plane crash that almost started World War III. This was a Korean Airlines commercial flight that flew into the Soviet Union's territory and it was shot down by the Soviet Union. 269 people on board died. Everyone on board died. And this was a massive story back in 1983. So, before we get started, quick little history lesson. So, if you look at every major war the United States has been involved in, there's always like this instigating event that kind of kicks off our involvement in the war. Usually, it's like a big explosion or something getting destroyed that kills a lot of people. And it kind of serves as like a catalyst to get the public on the side of supporting our entry into the war. So in 1898, all the way back in 1898, the USS Maine exploded. Supposedly, it was from a mine that was planted on board by Spain, and 258 US soldiers died. And this kind of became the event that really kicked off the Spanish American War. There was this phrase, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, kind of became like the rallying cry to get the US involved. And again, this was seen as like the event that really kicked off the Spanish American War. And before World War One, the ocean liner Lusitania was attacked by Germany. There's this big debate on whether this was secretly smuggling weapons, and Germany thought it was a warship, and that's why they sunk it. But the point is that over 1,000 people died, including 100 U.S. citizens died when this ocean liner was sunk. And again, this was kind of considered the event that really increased public support for getting involved, the U.S. involved in World War One. And then there's Pearl Harbor. Everybody knows Pearl Harbor in World War II. There's the Gulf of Tonkin incident that really escalated America's involvement in the Vietnam War when a couple US ships were supposedly, attacked for no reason. And, this was kind of held up as like the event that showed why we had to get involved in Vietnam. And then there's 9/11, which obviously kicked off the whole war on terror. So the point is that, well, first of all, each one of these events is insanely, insanely suspicious. I could do a full video on each one of these events, but the point is that right before the US enters these wars, all these wars, there's always like this one event that kind of kicks off everything. It's a catalyst that shifts public sentiment and gets people to support the war. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind as we talk about this airplane being shot down by the Soviet Union in 1983. So on September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 took off from New York City. It refueled in Alaska and then it flew on to South Korea. And once it got near the Soviet Union, it just started going way off course. It ended up being over 200 miles off course, just kind of flying through the air randomly. Now, very coincidentally, quote unquote, coincidentally, this brought it right its new course brought it right over a highly, highly sensitive area of the Soviet Union where they tested all these other like newest military technologies. It was a missile base as well. There were all these military installations in this area, and it was also known that this was a sensitive area, that a lot of secretive technologies were being tested here, that the Soviets were very protective of this area. And this wasn't like a secret or anything. It was very well known that any flights that kind of venture into this area run the risk of being shot down. So, long story short, this plane was like 200 miles off course in this very, very protected, very sensitive military region of the Soviet Union. Soviets had no idea if this was a commercial flight or a military one. They tried communicating with the pilots, didn't get a response. They dispatched some jets that went up there. They were firing warning shots and trying to communicate with the plane to land. Still didn't get a response. And so after all this was done, they shot the plane down, and all 269 people on board died. And from the start, right after this happened, the narrative was that the Soviet Union was just totally barbaric. They were just absolute animals who would shoot down a civilian plane and murder all these innocent people. And this story was just everywhere for a while. It was a massive, massive story. And, just always this language: murder, shooting to kill, barbarism, animals. And there were all these quotes featured in newspapers about people's reaction to this plane being shot down to do this sort of thing. Shooting down the plane is not like human beings, says the quote on the top. Let us call the crime for what it is: wanton, calculated, deliberate murder. We can see no excuse whatsoever for this appalling act. And then even the White House, released a number of statements. Now, this is from one of the White House aides who said it is further evidence that the president was right when he said the Soviet Union is a country that is essentially evil. So again, when this happened, this was really held up as like evidence that the Soviet Union was just these brutal, basically psychopathic animals who would do something so horrible as shooting down a civilian airliner. And real quick, an interesting little side note here is that the same thing happened about a decade earlier. In February of 1973. A Libyan Airlines flight flew over it was on its way to Egypt, and it flew over the Sinai Peninsula, and it was shot down by the Israeli Air Force for intruding into their airspace. And over 100 people on board this commercial flight died. There wasn't nearly the outrage about this as there was about the Korean Airlines flight being shot down in the Soviet Union. Guessing you probably aren't familiar with this one, but that's kind of interesting how the media coverage was so different for those two events. But anyway, the 007 crash came at a very convenient time because the really hot issue at the time was that the USA wanted to build all these nuclear missile installations around the world. And this was, these supposedly had to be built because the world needed to be protected from the Soviet Union because they were so evil and so, awful all throughout like 1981, 1982, as they tried to, get approval to build these missile installations. There were these just gigantic protests. And some of these protests said over 200,000 people showed up to them. So this was kind of like an event or this was an issue at least that it seemed like most people were really united on, that they just did not want these nuclear missile installations to be built in their country. Okay, so after the plane crash happened, there was all this outcry about how this is why we need these missile installations, because the Soviet Union is so evil and so corrupt and so awful that they would just shoot down a commercial airliner. That's how evil they are. And that's why we need these missile installations to protect the world from them. This article here is a good example of kind of some of the articles that started appearing right after this flight was shot down. This communists know no morality. The destruction of life means nothing to them. That is why they can, without conscience, shoot down a civilian airliner loaded with 269 passengers. But as kind of like more was learned about what exactly happened and what the story was here, turns out there was like way more to the story that emerged. The first thing was that there was a US spy plane in the region at the time, and there was some real confusion over whether the Soviets could even tell if what they were tracking on their radar was the spy plane or whether it was the commercial airliner. And there were even questions about whether this commercial airliner was kind of being used as like cover for the spying mission. And there were even reports that the spy plane flew into Soviet territory to activate the Soviet the missile defense system, because that was something that the US wasn't really like that familiar with. They had a lot of questions about how it worked. And so after this spy plane flew into the Soviet territory to activate this defense system, it then passed close to the it purposely passed close to the civilian aircraft to kind of like trick the Soviet radar into thinking that the civilian commercial craft was a military one. And then the Soviets shot down this commercial aircraft because they thought it was a military plane. The Soviets at least were basically kind of set up and baited into this. Interestingly, this also kind of ties in with the Space Shuttle Challenger, which is a recent video I did. Coincidentally, the Challenger, there's a lot of coincidences going on here with this story, but coincidentally, the Challenger was in orbit at this time. This is obviously years before it blew up. This was like its seventh or eighth mission, and the one it blew up on was its 10th or 11th. So, gone into orbit a number of times. But at the time that this 007 flight was blown up, the Space Shuttle Challenger was in orbit, and it was right in this general area. And the Soviets eventually, after they performed, all these investigations, they eventually came out and claimed that this was a spying mission and that the the information was being relayed to the Space Shuttle Challenger. And obviously, as I mentioned in the video I did, basically every astronaut has a military background. They're all military officers. All these space shuttle launches are basically military operations. But probably the most intriguing mystery about this crash was about someone who was on board this flight. This Congressman Larry McDonald, what just happened to be on board this Korean Airlines flight 007, and he died in the crash. And he is a really, really fascinating guy. So he was very, very anti-government, very anti-global elites, and he was very, very outspoken in these beliefs. He was also very anti-communist. This book, The Rockefeller File, was like a really in-depth investigation into the Rockefellers and kind of an expose of all the nasty stuff they're up to. And Larry McDonald actually wrote the introduction for this book. And what he wrote was the drive of the Rockefellers and their allies is to create a one world government combining super capitalism and communism under the same tent, all under their control. Do I mean conspiracy? Yes, I do. I am convinced there is such a plot, international in scope, generations old in planning, and incredibly evil in intent. So, again, this is a sitting U.S. congressman writing this intro and saying all this stuff. You can find a lot of really good videos of Larry McDonald, giving speeches and talking on YouTube and Rumble and other sites. This one featuring Ron Paul. Ron Paul in this video calls Larry McDonald the greatest American. And this is probably his most famous interview. And this happened just a few weeks before he died in the plane crash. And in this one, he goes on CNN Crossfire and he really talks about a lot about the Rockefellers, their one world government plan. And he's kind of like really almost bullied by this one interviewer. And the guy just basically tells Larry McDonald that he's full of it, that he's crazy, that, he has no idea what he's talking about. And him and Larry McDonald kind of like really go back and forth and get into it. It's a really, really interesting interview. I'll go ahead and play a clip here real quick. So I'll just play that here right now.
Mr. McDonald, I'm not a conspirator. I think even Buchanan would vouch for that.
Well, you are
Robert
Wilson.
Robert Wilson. No, I don't think so. Yeah, I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Is that a conspiracy?
You've certainly.
Let me just tell you what Newsweek says this. The John Birch Society considers communism only one arm of a master conspiracy in which socialist American insiders are plotting to establish world government. Now, it also says, and here's Director John McManus, that's your public relations director, saying that former Secretary of State Alexander Haig and CIA Director William Casey are two of these master conspirators who are plotting to establish world government. Now, what do you say? That kind of silly, asinine statement is what makes people laugh at the John Birch Society.
Well, Tom, I'm sure being a long-standing member of the Rockefeller apparatus and as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations of long-standing, you're fully aware that there is an elitist core in this country that has seen value in subsidizing communism or protecting communism.
It has?
Sure.
You're accusing me of subsidizing communism?
No, I'm saying
because
that
I happen to belong to a
there is an elite core.
Study group?
No, wait a minute. There is an elite core in this country that has dominated American society.
Well, I'm not one of them.
Well,
Trilateral Commission.
The Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations.
And again, that interview is from only a few weeks before Larry McDonald died in the plane crash. And this guy who is, performing this interview, quote unquote, it's not much of an interview, but this guy who's kind of, bullying Larry McDonald and calling him crazy is Tom Braden. This guy worked in the CIA for a long time. Then he became a journalist. And he wrote this article here. I'm glad the CIA is immoral. He clearly seems like he's a little biased, in particular in that interview. But anyway, Larry McDonald, another thing about him is he was very big into auditing Fort Knox and seeing if the gold was actually there, which is kind of interesting because that's kind of like a hot issue now that's being talked about. He was always just kind of perceived as like this big outsider in Washington, D.C. because he was a Democrat, but a lot of his views would be kind of perceived by people as being right wing. He was very anti globalist, very anti elite, very, very anti communist, very anti communist. And the fact that basically the leading anti communist in the US Congress just happened to be shot down on a plane by a communist country in the Soviet Union, our biggest communist enemy, was, obviously pretty coincidental. Initially, his wife and other people claimed that this plane crash was, basically a murder and he was the target and all the other people were just collateral damage. Seems like there'd be definitely much easier ways to kill him if all you wanted to do was just kill this one person. And I mean, it just seems hard for me to believe that the Soviet Union would incite all of this like anger towards their country and towards themselves just to get rid of this one guy. It seems pretty hard to believe that they would go to this length, such extreme lengths, just to get rid of this one guy. What seems more likely is that his death and this plane crash had something to do with an organization named Western Goals, which was an organization that Larry McDonald ran. It was this very secretive, very, very powerful organization that had a lot of mystery surrounding it. So we'll go ahead and tell the story of Western Goals here, real quick, and explain how this could tie into everything. And this whole Western Goals story begins all the way back in 1975 when it was revealed that the LAPD was keeping this massive database of California citizens and all this information about them. It was claimed that the LAPD claimed that a lot of these people were viewed as subversives, people who had been involved in like riots and protests and those sort of things. But it came out that a lot of the people in these files were like lawyers, doctors, executives, like people, just normal everyday citizens. These files were extremely detailed. It gave, the LAPD had information on like who these people were eating with, where they lived, where they hung out, what kind of vehicles they drove, just all this information. And basically, this information had been compiled by the LAPD, essentially spying on these people. It was even claimed that a lot of this information was obtained illegally by like LAPD officers breaking and entering houses and going on stakeouts and like, illegal things like that. Might not seem like a big deal today with like when you can get a lot of this information just by hopping on Facebook, but back then people were like very protective of their privacy and this was a big deal. People were really pissed when they found out about this. And after this whole thing came to light, it was revealed just how massive this whole operation was because the police were ordered to purge over 2 million files, 2 million sheets of paper with information. And when it was all said and done, there were over 50,000 people who the LAPD had in this massive database that they were keeping. And again, they were ordered to destroy all these files that they'd accumulated, and they said that they did. But then in 1983, this guy, Jay Paul, who was an LAPD detective, he ended up moving a lot of these files into his home and taking over 500,000 pages of intelligence files and documents. And he just kept them in his home. And what he did with these files is he supplied them to Western Goals, which is Larry McDonald's organization that he ran. And this Jay Paul, this LAPD detective, he would just constantly feed Western Goals information about these citizens that they were, spying on and compiling information on. And so this article here describes, Western Goals, describes it as Larry McDonald's own deep state. It wasn't really that. It was just, basically a private intelligence organization that just had this massive database of information and they had everything stored on a $100,000 computer. So that's like, $300,000 in today's money. So it was a really advanced operation too. And then what they would do is they would sell this information to agencies. So they would sell it to the FBI, they would sell it to the CIA, they would sell it to police departments. And so again, like, kind of like the big deal about this is that it was illegal because the LAPD had been ordered to destroy all this information. And instead, they stored it in this LAPD detective's house and supplied it to this private organization. And in 1983, right before the plane crash that killed Larry McDonald, that's when this whole thing started to fall apart and this whole controversy started getting exposed. And the whole kind of issue here, then the whole focus of this whole thing was, did this J. Paul guy just do this on his own? Did he just steal these files on his own and store them on his own? Or had he been ordered to do this? Had he been like told to do this by his superiors? Because if it was his superiors defying a court order and telling him to do this, there were seriously powerful people in the LAPD who would be looking at getting in, some serious trouble and going down for this. But the bigger question that came out in 1983 as this all was revealed is, how much did the California governor know about this? Because there were some indications that people, California governor and a lot of people close to him, were involved in this as well. So it was people even much higher than just the LAPD. Because remember, it was like throughout the 1970s when a lot of these files started to be gathered and all this information was being gathered and all this spying was going on. And if you know your history, you'll know that this guy was the governor of California at the time. And there were all these indications that Ronald Reagan might have been pretty heavily involved in this whole spying operation. And it wasn't just Ronald Reagan, but it was people close to him as well. Ed Meese, who became the Attorney General of the United States, was always heavily involved with Ronald Reagan, dating back to California. There were a lot of indications that he was involved in this. And there were a lot of links between like Ronald Reagan's time as governor and all this information that was being gathered on all these California citizens, all of it, being gathered illegally, basically, in a lot of cases. And again, as all this was coming out in mid 1983, this was just right before the plane crash that killed Larry McDonald. This article here about this J. Paul and his trial, this article is from August 20th, 1983. So that's about, 10, 11 days before Larry McDonald died in the plane crash. And again, all this information that the LAPD was ordered to destroy in the 1970s, these hundreds of thousands of files, what ended up happening was they didn't destroy it. They just started supplying it to the private organization that Larry McDonald ran, which was Western Goals. And since J. Paul was providing this information to Western Goals and this trial was beginning around this time, all the leaders of Western Goals, including Larry McDonald, were subpoenaed to testify during the trial. And again, this was just right in August, early September of 1983. The plane crash that killed Larry McDonald happened on September 1st, 1983. So it seems like really coincidental timing that right as Larry McDonald was being subpoenaed to testify in this trial and tell everything about how Western Goals was receiving this information and how this whole arrangement worked, which again, and there seems to be some indications that Ronald Reagan was heavily involved in this. It seems really coincidental that right in mid 1983, right as Larry McDonald was subpoenaed and the Western Goals leaders were subpoenaed to testify in this case, that the whole plane crash that killed him just happens to occur. And I also do wonder if like the story of Western Goals is honestly much bigger than, kind of what the official story says. I really wonder what was in these files that they kept. What it sounds like to me is that this was a blackmail operation, that they were getting blackmail material on these people and storing it and just having this massive database of information that could be used to blackmail people. Because again, this Western Gold, this information they were getting, they had information on police commissioners, judges, politicians, like all these really powerful people. It wasn't just like a bunch of, nuclear war activists who were protesting nuclear energy. It was far bigger than that. So it does really seem kind of like a blackmail operation. Um, it's interesting because this book here by this guy, Rodney Stitch, who did a lot of investigations into the CIA and had a ton of contacts in the government. This is a really good book. And what he claims in the book, or rather, what this guy who he talks to named Trenton Parker, who was a major CIA operative, throughout the 20th century, this Trenton Parker claims that there was information about the assassination of JFK that was provided to Larry McDonald, and it was really damning information. Tape recordings of people discussing things, that sort of thing. And so it is interesting that, this obviously can't really be verified or anything like that, but that does kind of tie in with this whole idea that this Western goals operation could have really, been focused on blackmail. So anyway, there's so much going on here, but that's kind of the general story of this flight being shot down and Larry McDonald dying on it. Obviously, if you believe the official story, this flight was shot down because the Soviet Union, are just these heartless animals and they, don't value human life and they're just pure evil. Clearly there's way more going on here between the mystery of why it veered off course by hundreds, like 200 some miles, the fact that it just happened to be flying over this very, very sensitive military region. Obviously, the fact that a US spy plane just happened to be in this area is very interesting coincidence. Another interesting coincidence is that the Space Shuttle Challenger happened to be in this area as well. If you remember, the Soviet Union claimed this was a spying operation and that information was being relayed to the Space Shuttle Challenger. Obviously, there's the whole controversy and the coincidence of Larry McDonald being on board this flight. He was the biggest anti communist congressman in Washington, D.C., and he just happens to be coincidentally, quote unquote, killed by our communist enemy, the Soviet Union. It is very, very convenient that he died right as Western Gold was being subpoenaed to testify in this case about the LAPD spying on citizens and having all this information and providing it to Western goals. I mean, it's really convenient that he just happened to die before he could testify in this case and tell what he knew and also who was involved in this. Because there, as I mentioned, there were definitely indications that Ronald Reagan and people close to him may have known what was going on here. And then to me, the most telling thing is there's this whole issue at the time of the US wanting these missile installations installed all throughout Europe to, defend the world from the Soviet Union. Then this plane crash happens and it's held up as evidence that, like, oh, the Soviet Union really is pure evil. They're just so awful. Look at how bad they are that they would just shoot down a civilian airliner and murder 270 innocent people. And it really seems like this Korean Airlines flight being shot down really was like the event similar to these other events that have kicked off the United States involvement in, these major wars that we've been involved in. It didn't quite like have the effect that some of these had because there were all these questions really right from the get-go about this Korean Airlines flight and all the strange circumstances surrounding Larry McDonald being on the flight and the fact that it was so off course and the fact that there was just all this confusion. But it seems like they really did try to kind of have this Korean Airlines crash be an event similar to all these other main events that kicked off the US involvement in these major wars. It really just seems like there is a blueprint, and this crash of Korean Airlines flight 007 followed the same blueprint as these other events here. So anyway, that's kind of the story of this Korean Airlines flight and Larry McDonald's death and all the strange circumstances surrounding this whole thing. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon with another video.